to turn to Psalm 85. Psalm 85. We do not know the author of this psalm. We do not know the precise background of the psalm, though it appears from verses 1 through 3 that it was written just after the Lord had brought the people out of captivity. The psalm can be divided into three very simple thoughts. You have thanksgiving for God's deliverance in verses 1 through 3. You have in verses 4 through 7 a prayer for further and more complete restoration. And then thirdly, in verses 8 through 13, you have a joyful anticipation of the Lord granting such. The psalm begins with the psalmist looking back where he had been, where they had been as a people, God's gracious, merciful intervention in rescuing them. Verses 1 through 3, the psalmist reflecting upon the past and upon what the Lord had done for them, he realizes that the blessings of God have been abundantly bestowed upon them. Twice in verse 1, twice in verse 2, twice in verse 3, we read the words, "Thou hast." So you have 6 distinct references to what God had done in their lives. He's recalling the past interventions of God in their lives, how God had reversed the course in the past. And it's always good to look back upon our salvation, where we were heading before God intervened and God stepped in and broke the chains of sin and rescued us. Notice that in verses 2 and 3, that he recalls the blessedness of forgiven iniquity, covered sin, God taking away and turning away from his wrath and the fierceness of his anger that we so deserved. Again, we need to think upon those things. God has been so good to us. We are blessed beyond measure. After contemplating the blessings and the goodness of God toward them, the psalmist comes to the painful realization that they, as the favored people of God, the blessed recipients of God's grace and goodness and mercy, they were not where they should be with God. This is obvious from the language in verses 4 through 7. From verse 4, we gather that their lives were moving in the wrong direction because he prays, "Turn us, turn us." And from verses 4 and 5, they had things in their lives that were disapproved by God, indicated by the mention of God's anger. And though they had been so blessed of God, we gather from verse 6 that they still lacked some joy because they wanted their joy restored. Verse 7, though they had been delivered, they still had some bondage in their lives, indicated by the words, "Grant us thy salvation." And here we are, a people blessed with the goodness of God, and yet none of us are where we should be. None of us are where we could be. All of us have some bondage in our lives. We head in the wrong direction many times and need turning. There's areas in our lives where we need turning. We want to read this morning Psalm 85, verse 6. Very familiar verse. Wilt thou not revive us again, that thy people may rejoice in thee? This is the central part. This is the theme of his prayer. Revive us again. Notice again. It's something that they had experienced in the past, but they need it again. Revive us. It is a personal experience. It should go without saying, but you cannot be revived without the personal experience of reviving. It is revive us again. It is a reoccurring personal experience. I want to speak this morning on the personal experience of revival from God. Revive us again. That is a plea for God to act upon them in a particular way. It is a plea for God to do something to them. Again, a plea for God to act upon them. A plea for God to do something to them. It is a plea for God to produce an effect upon them. It is a plea for God to send a miracle upon them. Now, the plea has its basis in the fact that God had blessed them so in the past. And the psalmist knows that God is the one who can bless them in the future, and God is the one who can fix what is wrong. Revive us again. The very word revive implies something is wrong. But the psalmist knows God can fix what is wrong. And it's still so today. What the psalmist prayed and pleaded for and is seeking in this psalm, we ought to be praying for. We ought to be pleading. We ought to be seeking. A personal experience of a God-manufactured, God-produced, God-sent revival. And throughout this 85th Psalm, we learn many things about revival. I am afraid that there are a lot of God's people who have no idea what it means to be revived. No idea. We want to consider 5 matters concerning revival. First of all, there is such a thing as revival. Again, we hear the psalmist say, revive us. He's praying for something very, very specific. Revive us. He's praying for personal reviving. Revive. The word revive, of course, is made up of 2 parts. You have re, meaning anew or again, and you have vive, meaning to live. So it is to live anew, to live again. So revival is re-life, or life again. And there is such a thing. There is such a thing. The word revive conveys the idea of to restore, to bring back, to return, to recover, to raise, to awaken, to arouse, to stir, to invigorate, to rekindle, to refresh, to stimulate, and we could come up with other words as well, but you get the idea. All of this speaks of something very definite, genuine. Speaks of something that is visible, something that is personal, and therefore it is something that can be confirmed. Revival is real. The psalmist pleads, revive us, to stop, to reverse a wrong direction. And there is such a thing as a God intervening in a life and reversing a wrong direction. Is there any area of your life, any area, in which you might be going in the wrong direction? You need a revival in that area of your life. To revive is to stir. It is to disturb the quiet of. It is to arouse, to waken, to incite, to invigorate to activity. It is basically a spiritual resurrection. And there is such a thing. It is an influential visit from God. That's what the psalmist is praying for. It is an outpouring of God upon an individual or upon a people. In revival, God does a work. God does a fresh work in His people. And be sure of this, there is such a thing as spiritual revival. It does exist. It is a real matter. And as you read through this 85th Psalm, we see some characteristics of a revival. There is a turning. We read there, verse 4, turn us, O God. In revival, there is a bringing about an improved relationship with God. Notice also it says, cause thine anger toward us to cease. That's an improved relationship with God. Is there anybody who needs an improved relationship with God? Revive us. Again, there is such a thing. It includes verse 6, an enabling power. Notice what it says there in verse 6. Revive us again that we'll be able to do something, that we'll be able to experience something. It involves an enabling power. In revival, verse 7, there's an open display of God's mercy. It says, show, that is, manifest to us thy mercy. It involves deliverance, verse 7. Grant us thy salvation. And reading on in the psalm, you'll see in verse 12 that revival involves a manifestation of His glory. In all revival, there is a manifestation of the glory of God. And there is a manifestation of the blessings and God's fruitfulness. And there's conformity to God. We read there in verse 12, set us in the way of His steps. There is such a thing as revival. So from all of this, we see that a real and true revival from God is not without an inner disturbance of soul, a relinquishing of control, a letting go. A real and true revival involves confronting sin, our own personal sin. In all true revival, the Holy Spirit pricks and smites the heart concerning personal sin. In all true revival, God's people are brought face to face with their sins and with the character of their sins. As a result, God's people are brought low, and they are convicted, and they are burdened, and they are brokenhearted, and they're sorrowful and ashamed over their sin. And there is a hatred of sin. And there is a turning from sin, a forsaking of sin, a fleeing from sin, a victory over sin. This is what the psalmist is praying for. A real and true revival involves a change of heart. Hearts are warmed and made tender. Hearts are humbled and made responsive and submissive, and they become passionate. Hearts are focused. They become absorbed with God. Hearts are brought to acknowledge God. Hearts are filled with thankfulness and peace and assurance of God. This is what happens in a revival. Hearts are filled with song. Hearts are overcome with a desire and a passion for the Lord. And they long to be more identified with the Lord. Hearts are filled with the wonder of God. Hearts are caused to overflow with thoughts of God. And this is what the psalmist is praying for. In other words, a revival involves a changed life. In all true revival, lives are made more holy. Is there anyone that needs to be more holy? Is there anyone who needs to be more consecrated, more surrendered? Or are you as surrendered as you can possibly be? None of us are. Are you as holy as you can possibly be? None of us are. We need revival. Because in revival we have an increase in these things. A God-sent, God-manufactured, God-produced revival will cause men to be the husbands, the fathers they ought to be, and women to be the wives and mothers that they ought to be, and for church members to be the church members that they ought to be. And this is what the psalmist is praying for, a revival. And there is such a thing. It exists. You listen to people today in our circle of fellowship. Oh, we don't see revival anymore. As if there is no such thing. I'm here to tell you there is such a thing. And it still exists today. Secondly, the psalmist believed that not only is there such a thing as revival, but that revival is a possible reality. Not only is there such a thing, it is a possibility. Revival is more than just a word in religious circles. And it's more than just a historical fact. It is actual. It is visible. It's something that can be seen. It's something that can be felt. And again, it's something that can be confirmed. Make no mistake about it, there is such a thing as revival, and it is possible right now for each and every child of God. In this day of worldly mindedness, covetousness, prayerlessness, selfishness, idolatry, coldness, apathy, spiritual waywardness and pride and ingratitude and bitterness and wrath and anger and jealousy. I'm talking about God's people. I'm not talking about the world. Pride. In this day of spiritual pettiness and spiritual immaturity and instability and what we call habitual hypocrisy, do-it-yourself religion, emergency religion, these things have engulfed the lives of God's people. But there is such a thing as revival. And it's possible. And it's possible. At this present moment, many of God's people are courted by and drawn to the world. Many of God's people have had their hearts stolen a long time ago, and they don't even realize it. And they have fallen victim to a sin-sick society. And their spiritual interest, enthusiasm, and conviction has been swallowed up by an antichrist world. And so many individuals, so many marriages, so many homes and churches are being robbed and brought to ruin. And what people like to do today is blame it on everybody and everything else rather than pray, revive us again. But there is such a thing as revival, and it's possible. At this present moment of spiritual distractions, when the world has a death grip upon so many of God's people. God's people, many of them have more interest in the world than they do God. And they're more willing to invest in the world than God, and they are more invested in the world than they are God. And they have their priorities in the world rather than upon spiritual matters. And they're more dictated by the world than they are God. There is such a thing as a revival. There's not only such a thing, it is possible. It is possible. It can happen. In this time when so many of God's people, the things of God have become stale and stagnant. The service of the Lord has become a mere form. It's become mechanical, the shadow of the real thing. The ability to worship is almost extinct. True worship, the ability to truly worship God, is almost gone. Not people's definition of worship, but I'm talking about true worship to God. To truly worship God, one of the first prerequisites is you have to be disconnected from out there. And we make sure when we come into the house of God, most people, that they're still connected out there. That's why folks bring their cell phones in. Still connected. We don't want to break our connections. It's a sad time. But there is such a thing as a revival. And it's possible. In this day of abounding religious platitudes, and many are content with mere lip service, you don't have to hang around a church too long to learn the language. But that's all it is to many folks. They know what to say. There is such a thing as revival. And it's possible. Thirdly, the psalmist realized that God was the source of revival. There is such a thing as revival. It is possible. And we better know where it comes from. God is the source. He prayed in verse 4, "Turn us, O God." A turning from the hand of God. And then in verse 6, "Wilt thou not revive us again?" A revival from God. There is such a thing as revival. And it is possible. And if it does happen, it will come directly from God. And it will be the work of God. Revival is the result of an outpouring of God. It is the result of an inner working, a stirring from God. Revival is the inner movement, the inner exertion, the inner disturbance of God that compels an individual to follow the leadings and promptings of God. Know today that there is such a thing as revival. And revival is possible for you and I. And be sure of this, revival comes from God. No man can produce, no man can manufacture, no man can give birth to or create revival. It comes from God. The abilities, the plans, the methods, the calculations, the messages, the personalities of man cannot bring revival. There is such a thing as revival. And it is possible. But it only comes from God. Oh, how we ought to plead with God right now. Revive me. Revive me. Fourthly, the psalmist felt a need for revival. As you read the psalm, the need of revival is painfully obvious to the psalmist. From the very meaning of the word, revive, to restore, to recover, to stop and reverse, to raise, to refresh, to renew, to awaken, to arouse, to stir, to incite, to invigorate. Just from the very meaning of the word, the need for revival ought to be painfully obvious. Who doesn't need restoring? Who doesn't need to recover some things? Who doesn't need to reverse course in some areas? The need for revival is painfully obvious. Because of our sinful flesh and because of our natural inclinations away from God, we can and we do get in a state of spiritual decline, a state of coldness, a state of apathy, a state of distance from God, a state of detachment from God, a state of spiritual emptiness and bareness, a state of spiritual disease. There's a lot of spiritually sick, spiritually diseased people. Spiritual disease is real. And we can and we do become spiritually weary and even exhausted and lethargic in the things of God. And our minds can become so clouded with the philosophies and the reasonings of the world and so entangled in the affairs of this life. The need for revival is very, very obvious. Due to the fact that we can and we do lose our spiritual appetite, our desire, our excitement, our passion and zeal for the Lord. You can blame it on anybody you want, but rather than do that, pray, revive me. Revive me. And the things of the Lord do become mundane due to our sinful nature. And it's very common in so-called Christendom to substitute a form of godliness for the power thereof. Because all these things are so prevalent, every one of us to some degree is in need of a reviving from God. Every one of us have areas in our life that need to be restored. We all have areas in our lives that need to be recovered. There are areas in our lives where we need to be awakened and stirred and lifted up and refreshed. But today what people do, well, that's the times we live in. I'm backslidden, been backslidden for 20 years, but that's the times we live in. That doesn't have a thing to do with it. We need to pray. Revive us again. And then, lastly, the psalmist had a fervent desire for revival. It ought to be painfully obvious that we are in need of a reviving from God. The psalmist not only realized the dire need of such, but he earnestly desired such. Wilt thou not revive us again? He had a passionate and burning desire for a personal revival from God. The fact that a spiritual revival is a visit from God. Should we not desire such? Oh God, come down and visit me today. Revival involves an outpouring of God. Ought not we to desire such? We're talking about a revival that will upend lives. Here's the way people are. They don't like their life, but they sure don't want it to change. They don't like their lives, but they don't want anybody to upend their lives. Revival involves upending our lives. Wherever God sees fit to upend them. It's not up to us. Wherever God sees fit. How many of us are willing to pray, Lord, upend my life, wherever it needs upending? A revival that will bring personal and thorough change. A revival that will hurt our self-esteem. Many today don't want their self-esteem damaged. Well, in a real revival, your self-esteem is going to take a hit. It's going to happen. A revival that will disturb our comfort zones. God's people get very comfortable in their own ways. In the book of Deuteronomy, the mother eagle stirs the nest. Deuteronomy 32, I believe it is. A lot of folks need their nest stirred because they're quite comfortable. A revival disturbs one's comfort zone. Are we willing? Do we want to have our comfort zones disturbed? A revival that will cause us to relinquish control of our life, to let go of whatever it is we have to let go of, to let go of our plans. Well, I've been planning this all my life. What's your point? Are your plans in the way of God? This is the way I've always done it. What's your point? Revival changes these things. A revival will not allow us to stay in tune to the world. It will cause us to be more and more of a stranger to the world. It makes us more identifiable with Christ. There is such a thing as revival. And it is possible. And if it happens, it will come from God. The question is not, do we need a revival? That's not the question. Every one of us need revival in some areas of our lives. But the question that we must give careful and honest examination to, do I want revival in my life wherever it is needed? That's the question. Someone might say, well, of course, every child of God wants it. Oh, no, they don't. No, they don't. Do we truly want a revival where it is needed? Do we long for it? Do we crave for revival in our own hearts, in our own lives? A lot of folks, they don't mind if God revives someone else, just leave me alone. Does my heart ache for personal reviving? Plead with God, revive me. Revive me. We need revival. Individually. People like to, when they think about revival, they like to think of it as collective. Here's when collective revival happens. When individuals in a church are revived by God. Collectively, they're revived by God. But you cannot get away from individual revival. Do I want it? Do I want a God-sent, God-manufactured, God produced revival. One that will upset Satan. Not only will it upset Satan, but it will make those who are not serious about serving God very uncomfortable. When an individual is truly revived, those who are around them that aren't really serious about serving God, they get uneasy. They get very uncomfortable. We need a revival that will upset Satan and will make the pretenders uncomfortable. We need that. That God would restore. That God would strengthen our dedication, our surrender, our submission to the Lord. We ought to want a revival that will restore and strengthen trust in the Lord. A revival that will restore and strengthen zeal and passion and determination to be and to do what God would have us to be and to do. A revival that will break the chains and set folks free. And if you listen real close, you don't have to listen that close, but if you listen, all through Baptist churches, you will hear the clanking of the chains. People's lives are enslaved, they're in bondage. And they bring their chains to the house of God. Everywhere is the clanking of the chains. And they don't want to be disturbed. I've wore this chain for 30 years. I'm not about to give it up now. I've become used to it. God help you. Oh, we need a revival that will break the chains. A revival that will bring a new harmony and new fellowship with the Lord. A revival that will cause our cups to run over. A revival that causes us to leave here and go out there with God all over us. Again, a revival is an outpouring of God. We need to have God all over us. Oh, we have a lot of things all over us. But what we need is to have God all over us. So, oh, may we join in with the psalmist. Revive us. Revive us. Revive us. Revive me. Revive us or start with me. That's a good question. Where do you think revival needs to start? Where do you think it needs to start? Well, it needs to start in the same place with every one of us. With ourselves. That's where it needs to start. It needs to start there. Revive us again. Revival's more than a week of meetings. You see, people can't hardly stay in the week anymore, so now most meetings are down to 3 days. And we had revival. Did you? Probably not. You may have had a so-called revival meeting, but you didn't have revival. We need that today. We need it desperately. We need it desperately in our lives. Brother John, if you come and lead us verse song.